Hey everybody, welcome back to Jay Wood Fly Fishing on YouTube. I'm here to do another video for you. This one I am going to demonstrate one of my favorite little flies. If there was one fly I had to pick to fish anywhere for trout in rivers or still waters, and I could only use one fly, this would be it. I would just change the size and color depending on where I'm at. But this one I'm going to do for you today is my absolute favorite color. It's kind of an overlooked color, but it does extremely well for most betas and caddis hatches, and in the very, very small sizes for midges. And the body and the tail on this, the abdomen I should say, or marabou, and the color I'm using is ginger, and this happens to be a hairline. But I really, really love this color, especially in for like PMDs. This is a great emerger. You can fish this fly a lot of different ways. You can use it as part of a nymphing rig. You can just strip it in still waters. You can swing it in rivers. And one of my absolute favorite ways to fish this is, especially during caddis and mayfly emergences, is to put this underneath a yarn indicator or a big dry fly about 2 feet back, maybe 2.5, and cast it out, get it into the drift upstream of where the fish are feeding, and then as your dry or your indicator drifts into the feeding zone of the fish, pop the end of your rod and make that indicator or dry fly jump. And what that does is it causes the soft hackles on this to pulse when the fly jumps up in the water column from the tension on the tippet. Fish just go crazy for this, and the strikes that you get are normally very vicious. You don't have to set the hook. The fish do it for you. Now before we get started tying, I wanted to explain a little bit about the marabou that we're using. Now this is just strung marabou quills, you know, and they come like this. It's just a big sewn together group of feathers. But when you sort through those feathers, there's a particular feather that you're looking for to do this particular fly, especially when you want to do it for mayflies, because you want the body to be fairly slender. And the way we're going to use this marabou is to pluck off a few barbs off of the stem and twist them together to create, like, it looks like a dubbing rope, but it's perfectly tapered, and you'll see that when we get there. Now, there are basically 3 different kinds of feathers. One I'm not going to talk about that you'll get out of these strung marabou feathers. The 2 that we're concerned about are, they're good full length. They've got defined barbs that are of a really, really good length. But the difference between these 2 feathers is that when you look at the barbs on this one, and this is the one that we're not going to use, you will look at the barbules along the length of the barbs, and you'll see that they're pretty long all the way out to the end of the barb. Now right up here towards the tip, you've got a really fine taper to the end where the barbules, which is the little fibers that come off of the end of the center barb, are very, very short. Now on this feather, you'll see that these barbs on one side of the feather are very sharp and pointed with really fine short barbules right here. I mean, it comes to a really fine taper, and I hope you can see that pretty well. And if you look at the other side of even this same feather, you'll see that you've got the longer barbules coming farther out. We do have a point right on the very tip, but very quickly these barbules get long. Now if you use those, what you're going to end up with is a very fat abdomen on this, and we want to try to keep that slender. That's a little less important for caddis than it is for mayflies, but for mayflies, I like to keep these things slender. And it may be a little bit confusing what I'm trying to explain right now, but as we tie this bug, I think it'll become a little more clear. So let's get started. The hook that I like to use on this is a Mustad S80 or 3906, and that is a 3X heavy standard length. It's actually for Mustad, for this hook, it's a little bit shorter than standard, and I really like that for this particular fly. I like the 3X heavy because I want this hook to hold up very well whenever it gets those vicious strikes. I used to tie these on dry fly hooks so they stayed closer to the surface. Two things that I learned fishing them over time is that this thing sinks a little bit better than the dry fly hook and gets it down so that you're going to get more action when you pop that indicator and it jumps. The other thing is when you're getting really vicious hard strikes on this thing, a dry fly hook can open up just enough so that you'll hook the fish just for a second, but then it's gone. You get the fly in and the hook bend is opened up a little bit. With this, you do not have to worry about it. And this is a barbed hook, and I do like to smash those barbs down before I fish them, but I like that little bump on there because I think it holds a little bit better when you do hook a fish than some of the barbless hooks. Now the thread I'm going to use, let me say first that I tie this fly, this particular one in the ginger, from a size 14 all the way down to a 20. Now when you get down to a 20, they're a little tricky getting the hackle collar on there, but it can be done. What I like to do is I start with the 14s and work my way down to the smaller flies when I'm completely out. When I'm not, I try to tie a couple 16s, a couple 18s, and then work my 20s, and that gets the hands tuned up so that when you get to handling that tiny little hackle feather, you're going to end up doing a little bit better job. Now, the thread on this particular one is a rusty brown. I'm using 8/0, which is a little bit small for this size 14, but it keeps the bulk down around the head when we're getting ready to wrap that soft hackle and makes it a little bit easier to handle. First off, we're going to start the thread, and I'm going to start about 1.5 hook eye lengths back and get the thread started. Now, do not pop or cut your tag end off. We're going to use that later to help reinforce the marabou rope. Now for a flash in the tail, I'm going to use 2 strands, and I use 2 strands from 14 all the way down to 18. When I get down to the 20s, I only use 1 strand of this flash because 2 strands is just too much bulk on a 20. And for this particular color variation, I am using bonefish tan. I used to use root beer, but I couldn't get it once and started using a bonefish tan. I think it looks better, and I seem to have a little bit better response from the fish. Now you see I tied it in right where I'd started my thread, and now I am holding the thread and the crystal flash in my material hand, and you can see I've kind of created a V there. And what I want to do is I want my thread to be on my side of the hook completely, like right on the very side of the hook, on the tire side of the hook, and then I want the crystal flash right dead up on top. And I'm going to go until that thread hangs right at the back of the barb, right at the very end of the hook shank. Now I'm going to jump forward 1 wrap about the thickness of the hook shank. And that's going to help us to lock our marabou down here in just a minute. Now, to get the length of the tail flash, all I'm going to do is fold that forward, clip it right there at the front of the eye of the hook, and then just pop those things down. Okay, for handling our marabou, this is a feather I've pulled a couple of clumps off already. And you can see, again, see how long and slender and pointed those barbs are? That's what we're looking for to get the long, slender taper on the abdomen. Now, a couple things about marabou feathers. I'm going to start with this one right here, just to show you, is that when you take that feather and you brush all of the fibers forward, you're going to see that the end of that is even. But if we continue down the feather right to the end, you'll see that some of these barbs towards the back of the feather aren't quite as long. Now that's important in a couple of aspects, because we want our tail, all the fibers on our tail, to be even on the ends. So I'm going to brush that down, and I'm going to find out if the barbs I'm going to select are going to be even, and they are not. You can see them when I get right down towards the end of that feather. They're kind of popping out. So that's going to make a difference in how I handle this feather and how I get these barbs off of here. To get the barbs off, I'm just going to kind of hold them out from the stem, and you can see I've got a pretty good amount. I want a little over 1/4 of an inch, maybe even 3/8 of an inch along the stem. I want about that many barbs. I don't generally count them for one of these flies. I want a pretty good amount, and then I'm just going to check and make sure that those are even. Now, the way that the feather grows, all of these barbs here at the back are a little bit longer than the barbs towards the front. It's just more prominent towards the very tip of the feather, but you still have that same growth pattern towards the back. And let me see if you can see that. You see some of those barbs are a little bit shorter. Sorry, my fingers might be in the way. Let's try it this way. So I'm going to take this off of here in the same manner I would towards the front, and that's by adding a little bit of the natural slant to the barbs before I pull them off. And then when I pull them off, you can see they're kind of at an angle where they released from the stem. Now I'm going to put just a little bit of moisture on my fingers using my little sponge cloth. You don't want it wet, you just want it damp, because you don't want to get these things soaking wet. And spin the ends, the butt ends together so that they kind of bind. And I'm going to get a little bit of moisture on my other hand and spin those barbs. Well, that didn't work out. Now did it? Let me start this over. I'm going to grab another group, doing the exact same thing, and we'll go through that spinning process again. Now you can see how I'm pulling those off of there at an angle. And we've got, if all of those came out even, my tips would be uneven out at the end of that marabou. Alright, so spin that. A little bit of moisture. There we go. And those are kind of contained. Now the length of the tail, I want it to be just a little bit longer, and I'm not getting real fussy about exact length, but I do want it a little bit longer than the flash. Probably about half of the hook gap, maybe even 2/3 of the hook gap longer than the length of the flash. I'm going to position that and then grab it with my material hand and let that marabou fall on my side of the hook, because whenever I wrap my thread up, it's going to pull that marabou right up on top of the hook. And I'm wrapping it forward of where I stopped the thread wrapping, and I hope you can see that thread right there. There's a little bit of gap. Now I'm going to take one more wrap and jump back to where my tag end of my thread is. Then I'm going to pull this marabou back and make one more wrap right in that same position. make another one on top, a second one on top, and then that one kind of drops off, and then bring my thread forward. Now what I've done is I've locked that marabou in place so that when I pull on it and twist it around my thread tag here in a minute, I'm not going to pull it loose. When I first started tying these long ago, I didn't do that, and every once in a while I get too rambunctious and you end up pulling this thing. It slides, the tail is not the right length, some of the fibers will slide, some of them don't. It's just kind of a mess, but locking them down with that folding motion solved that problem. Now what I'm going to do is pull my thread up alongside the marabou and cut it so it's just a little bit longer. Again, I'm going to take a little moisture, and right up here at the end of the butts, you want to make sure you've got them all. Now they're not all the same length because of the way we pulled them off of the stem. And you see I twisted that and it made a perfectly tapered, fuzzy little rope. That is something that's really hard to do with dubbing, and that's one of the reasons I started using marabou. And so now we've got our rope all spun up. I've got this, I put this in my rotary hackle pliers, and I like the short ones for this because I'm going to spin around and wrap that just like I would a dubbing noodle. And you can see as I wrap, you've almost got a segmentation in there. I mean, it's in there, but it's not very prominent. It's very subtle, which you're going to have on an emerging insect. And you've got a taper. And then when you get up here towards the butt end, you can see that the barbules, the little fibers coming off the center of the barb, are a little bit longer. Now I've wrapped that up to where it's right about where I started my thread. And I'm going to catch it with one wrap over the top, keep tension on that, let it go, get my hackle pliers off of there, and then I can go in front with a couple of wraps and back over the top with a couple of wraps. I'm going to pull that back, and I'm going to wrap all the way up to the eye of the hook and trim off the butts of the marabou. And there we go. There you have the abdomen and the tail and the little flash in there. And that's a really good imitation of a shuck coming off of a bug. Now here's another thing that I discovered about marabou when I started fishing it, is that the barbules along this marabou abdomen catch air, and they hold that air and it kind of glows. And that's a really good imitation of what happens when either a caddis or a mayfly is emerging. And I think that's another reason that this works so well. Now for the thorax, I'm going to take 3 strands of just your run-of-the-mill peacock herl, trim the ends, and I like to use the tip end for this. I'm going to bring my thread back a little bit, catch those in, make sure I've got nothing hanging out here over the eye, and bring my thread back to where I'm catching where I caught my marabou rope in, and get that with my thread. I'm going to turn this upside down, and this is, if you've got a rotary vise, this is one of the great things about having that rotary vise. This peacock herl is kind of delicate, so I like to spin it around the thread 3 or 4 times and then just wrap it onto the hook. Now I've still got one more wrap on there. I'm just going to pull that peacock up while my thread hangs, and that's going to lock that in place from behind. Now I'm going to go in front of it, and that is locked in there. It's not going anywhere because we've got the wraps inside the herl, and then we've got one behind and in front. Trim that off, and that's all you need for that. But I'm going to give it a couple more wraps backwards and get right up behind the eye of the hook. Now, I am going to use a partridge, Hungarian partridge feather, and I'm taking this, I know where this is at, where I need to be on this skin. pluck one of these out of here if I can get one separated. And I've got two. Let's break one of those away. Here's what your feather looks like. I'm going to strip all of this fuzz off of the butt end of the feather. And then this is what we have right here. Now I want my barbs on this feather to be about as long as the entire hook. And you can see when I hold that up there like this, up against the center stem, that is exactly what I'm looking for. But I don't want too many, so because I only want like 2 wraps of fibers. So I'm going to strip just a few of those off of there. I didn't take off a whole lot. And that's what I've got for my semi-prepped feather. This is how, if I want to strip a bunch off before I get going, this is the point I get them to before I start tying. Now before we tie it in, I want to face this with the cup up or towards me, however I'm holding it. And then I'm going to take these round end tweezers and I'm going to reach in there. I'm going to grab the very end of the center stem and then just take these barbs and stroke them back all the way up to where I've grabbed it. Now we'll get that one last one there. There we go. And if you stroke them back just right, they'll grab one another and stay in place. Let that go. Now I'm just going to take that, hold it in position with that part right over where my thread is. Let me stroke that thing back again so it doesn't get in the way. There we go. Hold that right where my part is, and I've got it rotated to my side just a little bit because whenever I wrap that thread around, you can see it pulls that feather around with it. And that went a little bit beyond top dead center, and that's okay. You can just kind of work it back around. Now once I've got that locked in place, I'm just going to trim that excess tip off. Now, holding pressure with my bobbin hand on the thread, I'm just going to fold that thing over. And I want the cup of the feather, because it's got a natural curve to it, I want it curved down around the hook like that. And that's going to help us get our barbs pointing in the direction that we want. Now I've wrapped back over the stem here, and you can see it's kind of pushed these barbs back a little bit, and I've built the base for the head of the fly. I'm going to wrap that back all the way, almost all the way back up to the eye, but not quite. Now we're just going to put that in the old hackle pliers. I'm sorry my hand is in the way, I know it is. We get that just right, there we go. Now, I've got it in the pliers, and I want to stroke all those fibers back before I start that wrap. And I'm going to start that, and you can see the fibers are pointing backwards because I stroked them back and how we had them cupped over the hook. And that's what causes those fibers to give that nice round backwards profile on those barbs. And that gives me 2 wraps. And as I come around, I'm going to catch that with my thread, hold some pressure on the bobbin so the stem doesn't unwind, catch it a couple of times on top, and then go in front once, and I'm going to go over the top a couple of times again, and just alternate that back a few times, over and then in front, and that locks that stem down. Clip it off as close as I can without nipping my thread, and then just kind of cover the end of that stem. I'm going to hold these back, all these barbs, and build the head. Now when you're tying these bigger ones, if you want to use 6/0, you can do that. Just be careful not to get too many wraps and build a gigantic head on there. And once I get that built, all we've got to do is give it a little whip finish. And you can see that nice kind of a dull orange head. And this is another thing that I used to use just a tan thread, and I caught some fish, but it was one of those things I thought, let me try this orange. And I think I was tying them for an October caddis hatch, and it worked really well, especially for that October caddis hatch. And I had some of those left over and started fishing again in the spring, and that orange seemed to outperform the ones with the tan heads. So I just stuck with the this rusty brown, which is kind of a dull orange, and this has been my go-to. Again, this is a really, really good pattern for trailing behind a dry emerger PMD, trailing behind an emerging caddis. You can change the color, go to a olive dun or even a medium olive for when BWOs or some kind of betas are coming off. If you've got darker caddis or tan caddis coming off, you can alternate that. But for me, all around, for most situations, this ginger is just a killer color, and this is a killer pattern. Try fishing it several ways. Swing it, jump it. The Lysen ring lift is a really good way to do it, and that's kind of my using the indicator and jumping the indicator or the dry fly is kind of a modification of the Lysen ring lift. Gives you a little more control, gives you the ability to spot exactly where your fly is at. But tie a few of these up, give them a try. I've caught a lot of really good fish with these things. On the bighorn, this was my go-to this year during the PMD hatch. And it also worked in the evening when the caddis were on the water. Even though they were ovipositing, the fish still really popped this thing when I use that technique where I jump it, let it sink a little bit as you let it drift, and then jump it, pop it, and adds a lot of action, and the fish just went crazy for it. Again, the strikes are going to be quite vicious, so I don't like to fish it with anything less than a 4X, especially if there are large fish around. A 5X or a 6X with this thing is going to pop it right off. Practice these things, tie them all the way down to a size 20. That's going to take a little bit of practice. Fish them through some of the hatches that you encounter on the river and on lakes, and I guarantee you they're going to catch some fish for you. Till next time, peace, love, and fly fishing, my friends.